2 books. I was talking with Ann Owens. Ann, raise your hand. Okay, I was speaking with Ann just now, and she triggered a memory of 2 books that you really ought to read. One is by Richard Rohr. It's called Falling Upward. And the other is by Joan Chittister. You familiar with her? Wonderful. The Gift of Years. Her book, The Gift of Years. So The Gift of Years and Richard Rohr's Falling Upward. I got The Gift of Years from my mother as a gift when I was bemoaning the loss of my hair. And she said, "Oh, Philip, there are so many other things to think about and occupy your time and attention." And she gave me the book, The Gift of Years, and it worked. I ditched the comb over, and I was set free. "36 years ago, a woman in the Quaker meeting I was pastoring, or I wasn't pastoring it, I was attending it at the time, came up to me, and in the Quaker tradition, you don't say, 'I feel called to be a minister.' The community has to notice the gifts, and then they approach you and say, 'Would you consider, we think you're being led to do this.' And so this woman approaches me. Her name was Annis Carter, and she was involved in the 6-Day War in Israel. She was the head of the Ramallah Friends School in Ramallah, Palestine. And when an Israeli tank pulled into their school compound, she stood like this in the middle of the compound, put her arm out like that, and the guy driving the tank backed up and left. And so that's the kind of person Annis Carter was. So she came up to me and she said, "Philip, you ought to be a Quaker pastor." And she actually didn't call me Philip. She wasn't very good with names. She called me Steve. And I never felt like I could correct her and just say, so whenever she just said Steve, I would just, yes, Annis. And so she said, "Steve, you ought to be a Quaker pastor." So I quit my job, and I went to college for 4 years, and then seminary for 4 years, and then returned to that Quaker meeting to speak one Sunday morning. And after meeting for worship, I went to the back and was greeting people as they left the meeting. And Annis Carter came up to me and shook my hand and then said, "Steve, I think I was mistaken." She passed away about 10 years later. But every time I saw her, she let it be known that I hadn't become the kind of pastor she had wanted me to be. She had hoped that I would be more orthodox than what I would confine myself within the boundaries of orthodoxy. But I've never been one to follow directions. I'm just terrible at directions, so I don't follow them. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion that if there were a straight path to God with clear and printed instructions, I wouldn't take it. That instead I would wander and meander and poke along and retain what resonated with my experience and let go of what didn't. But my pattern always went something like this. And this is the focus of a book I'm working on now called Unlearning God. And here was my pattern. That first I would learn something about God, usually something taught me by the church. I would embrace it as a great truth and believe it with all my heart. And then something would happen, either a deep sorrow or a great joy or a revealing discussion or an out-of-the-blue insight, maybe a peak experience that would cause me to reconsider what I had been taught. Sometimes that was exciting and joyful. Other times it was very frightening, upsetting. Sometimes a new insight came very quickly, filling the void of the insufficient answer. Other times, no new understanding rushed in to take the place of the old. Indeed, there are questions whose answers I know I will never know. So first I learned about God, then I unlearned, and then sometimes I learned again. And because God likes a good joke, I've even recommitted to beliefs I once rejected. Like those couples who are married and then they get divorced and then they remarry, and it works the second time for some reason. Sometimes things just work better the second time around. But I know this experience isn't unique to me, because as a pastor, I've had other people tell me their stories of belief, their journey, and their fearful confessions of changing their minds, the exhilaration of fresh discoveries, the exploration of new territory for which no maps have been drawn. So as I said, I've been writing this book called Unlearning God. Since learning something new about God invariably means first unlearning something old about God. And sometimes after my unlearning, as I said, I learned something new. Other times I've not found anything to replace the old. I only know the old answer no longer sufficed. It's a bit like when I was a teenager and I dated this girl for 3 years, and she broke up with me. And I said, "Why are you doing this? Who are you going to date?" And she said, "I don't know, but it is possible for me to know that I don't want you in my life without yet knowing who will replace you." Sometimes life is like that. We know the old isn't working, so we let it go, even though we have no idea what might take its place. That's just the way life is. While working on this book, people would ask me its title, and I usually don't reveal titles before the book is done, because somebody will say something that they don't like it and it'll ruin my day. But I decided with this book, if anybody asks, "What are you working on?" I'd tell them. And when I tell them the title, Unlearning God, they always say this, almost invariably: "Well, if you're going to tell us what you no longer believe, I hope you tell us what we should believe." And I tell them, this book isn't about what you should or shouldn't believe. It is about my experience with God, which might be similar to your experience. As for telling you what to believe, I wouldn't presume to do that. You must figure that out for yourself. And after these conversations, I always wonder why we have ceded this most intimate of matters to the church and clergy. Why have we always given them that power, that territory? Yes, thinking deeply about God is challenging work. There's no doubt about it. But no one can do that for us. It would be like paying another person to love our spouse when we found it maddening. Why are we so willing to let others do this work for us? Do we believe we're incapable of thinking about God? Are we worried that we might think the wrong thing about God and be punished for it? Are we afraid of where our doubts and our questions might lead? So the book talks about the things I've had to unlearn about God. Beliefs that were impossible to sustain, so it became necessary to let them go, to unlearn them. And let me say this. My unlearning might one day lead me to no longer believe in God. My unlearning might one day lead me to give up on God altogether. That is always the risk. Just as every marriage carries the risk of divorce, every relationship of faith carries with it the risk of unfaith. That hasn't happened yet, but it's happened to people I know. Happened to my co-author, Jim Mulholland. After writing 2 books with me, he stopped believing in God. Took me a while to sort that out. It's happened to a lot of people I know. People I would have sworn were exempt from existential U-turns. I think no less of them. In fact, I admire the courage of the thoughtful and sensitive atheist. It is not an easy position to hold in a culture which values and almost requires some declaration of faith from us. Here's another something interesting I've learned. That the people I've known who most adamantly believe, who would never confess to a moment of doubt, are often the ones either on the verge of or in the process of a great unlearning. Hoping their doggedness will somehow smother their growing doubts. It doesn't work. I tried. Trust me on this. It doesn't work. While we always risk unbelief, unlearning the things we've been taught about God is not an abandonment of faith. It is in some ways the beginning of faith, the realization that someone else's faith is a poor substitute for having our own. But once we decide to become people of faith, we simultaneously commit ourselves to growth and change. We may not realize that at the time, but changes of mind and heart are part and parcel of our spiritual journeys. Avoid those persons in your life. Avoid those persons who claim always to have believed the same thing and demand that you do the same. I was talking with a group of Catholic priests up at a seminary in Chicago, and I began the talk by saying, how many of you believe the same thing you were taught at First Communion when you were 7 years old? And they all started laughing, except for one priest who raised his hand and said, I believe the exact same thing. I've never changed my mind. And another priest on the other side of the room said, I absolutely believe it. You've killed every church you've ever pastored. Because what he was really saying is that he has refused to permit his encounters with God to reshape his life and his mind. And that's what he's done. And that's what he urged his congregation to do. And people left in droves. Now, a word about orthodoxy and exploration. I'm not sure why some people readily believe everything they're taught and some people don't. I used to just dismiss it as ignorance and stupidity. But I don't do that anymore. I think it's deeper than that. Or laziness. I think it'd be easy to dismiss the orthodox types as ignorant or fearful or lazy, and then make the exploring types, like me, kind of brave and thoughtful. But I suspect it's more complex than that. Our spiritual impulses are often very deep-seated and not easily surrendered. They're rooted in our personalities, our upbringing, our life experiences, among other things, and it might also be a case of personal preference. That those Christians who appreciate creeds and doctrines and traditions gravitate toward pastors and churches that value those things, and Christians who value theological inclusivity and exploration and seeking tend to gravitate toward churches and pastors who share those passions. A tragedy of the church is our failure to appreciate the value and importance of both approaches. And I've clearly pitched my tent in the exploration camp. Though I've done that, I'm glad there are others who value doctrines and orthodoxy and tradition. And here's the analogy I make. That to me, these are the people who are the string tethered to the kite, creating the tension that makes flight possible. Have you ever tried to fly a kite without a string? You can't do it. The tension is what makes the flight possible. Where it becomes problematic is when they only will play out the string so far, limiting the heights to which we might ascend. While explorer types have often cited the value of theological diversity, many of the orthodox types I've encountered see little value in theological exploration, even though their beliefs, which seemed timeless to them, were once the new kid on the block. That has been the genius, I will admit, of evangelical Christianity in America, to make so many people believe that what they teach is rooted in the first century experience of Jesus and the Apostle Paul. I can't count the times I've heard truths attributed to the Apostle Paul that were clearly a product of the American revivalism of the last century. I mean, come on, do we really think the Apostle Paul was some first century Billy Graham who went about Rome teaching the 4-point plan of salvation? That stuff had its origins, and it wasn't with Paul. After 33 years of ministry, I still believe in God, but not the God I believed in decades ago. That God is no more, just like the mother I know as a child, that I knew as a child, isn't the same person to me anymore. She isn't the same mother. We have a different sort of relationship now. It had to change in order to continue. 33 years ago, I would have said that what I believe now is heretical. Today, I don't use that word since I've had it used against me, and I don't care for it. The minute we dismiss someone else's beliefs while championing our own is the exact minute the conversation ends and the exact moment the growth stops. This life of exploration has meant everything to me. It has kept me connected to a community I love, in a faith tradition I treasure. So I want to tell you now in our time together the story of how this exploration began. And it began not with my first affirmation of faith in the Catholic Church when I was 7. It began with my first doubt. My Baptist father married my Catholic mother in 1955. Ecumenism had not yet been invented. So both of the families were horrified. My father's Southern Baptist family, my mother's Roman Catholic family were horrified because they knew the other family was going to roast in hell. Over his parents' objections, my father signed a document promising to raise my siblings and me in the Catholic Church. I was baptized before my father changed his mind. Water was sprinkled on me, words were said over me, and I was saved. Just like that, a member of the one true church. Destined for heaven, along with my family, except for my father, which is why I cried when the priest sprinkled me with water. My mother reminded me of that. She said, "You were crying when you were baptized. I bet you were so happy." And I said, "No, I was worried about Dad." Sensing even then my father was screwed. And I remember the nuns, they would urge me to pray for my father in hopes that he would see the error of his ways, dispense with heresy, and embrace the true faith of St. Peter, the first pope, and Jesus' best friend. And I talked with my father about it, who seemed curiously uninterested in joining the one true church. And since there was only so much I could do, I handed the problem over to God and let him worry about it. A word about God is He. When I was a kid, God was a man. Then I went away to college and seminary and learned that God was also a she. Today, I am in search of a singular, gender neutral program that would be theologically acceptable to a Southern Baptist in Birmingham and an Episcopalian from New York City. So let me know if you have one of those pronouns. I'll buy it from you. The Catholic Church I belong to, the one true church, swarmed with children, roomfuls of kids of all ages, families with 8, 9, and 10 kids, families so large the parents stopped naming their children and assigned them numbers. They were just everywhere. Church services every morning, 2 masses on Saturday, twice on Sundays to accommodate everyone. The pews packed. a pew that would normally hold 6 people held a dozen. Kids stacked 2 and 3 deep on laps. In terms of sheer numbers, we beat every church in town. And 2 nuns as old as dirt ran the show. 50 kids jammed into a room no bigger than this area here, with 1 nun in charge rendering us mute with fear. This was back in the days when the nuns wore habits, before they got sneaky and went undercover, dressing like the rest of us to blend in and catch us sinning. It now seems ironic that the priests and nuns of my populating my childhood wore black and white. I'm not sure which ancient cleric picked those colors, but I wonder now if it were intentional, even sacramental, an outward sign of an inward reality, black and white, true and false, good and evil, heaven and hell, in or out, no in-between, no shades of gray, no dash of color, no theological nuance, no straying from the reservation. So my father was out, as were the billions of other people not fortunate enough to be born Catholic. And it wasn't just the Catholics with the lock on heaven. The Protestants, I knew, were also sending one another to hell in record numbers. I would later become a Quaker, one of the most peaceable denominations in the history of Christianity, and even some of them cheerfully sentence certain people to hell. But when one's own father is condemned to hell, it's hard to think well of the institution sending him there. Not only hard to think well of the institution, but hard to take it seriously when they talk about God and Jesus and love. All of whom I wanted to believe in. I wanted to believe in Jesus, to believe in God, to believe in the one true church, but the one true church made it nearly impossible. I was 8 years old, maybe 9, and a nun, I can't remember her name, told me that if I hated God, I would die. I remember those words, if you hate God, you will die. And so that intrigued me. How soon, I asked. I was a stickler for details. God will strike you down that very moment, she said. So that night I put her to the test under the covers lying in bed, and I whispered, I hate God. I hate God. I hate God. I said it 3 times because of the Trinity. I wanted to make sure I hated the complete Godhead, that my hate would be widely dispersed. And I whispered it because I shared a bedroom with my brother David, and I didn't want him to hear me and rat me out to Mom and Dad, who would most certainly have done something to me even if God hadn't. Besides, I reasoned, if God knew our every thought, then God could hear me whisper. I didn't have to say it out loud. And so I said that, and I lay there in bed and realized after a while that I wasn't dead. That either God didn't strike down people who said they hated him, or God couldn't know our every thought, which meant the nun was full of beans. Either way. And I remember that was my first doubt. That was my first doubt, that something I had been taught by an authority in the church wasn't true. And now that I think about that story, I'm almost embarrassed to tell it. Laying in bed saying, I hate God 3 times. It sounds like something the little bratty girl in The Exorcist might say. And I'm surprised my head didn't spin 360 degrees and I didn't vomit out green goop. Instead, I went to sleep, and when I woke up the next morning, I felt great. Maybe God knew I didn't mean it, that I was testing the nun. So in a moment of grace, as is God's habit, elected not to smite me. And I didn't mean it, because given my inexperience, I neither loved nor hated God. God was mystified me. Did she live up in the clouds or inside of me? Did I disgust God or did I please God? Did God love everyone or love some and hate others? Was God a capitalist or a communist, a Republican or a Democrat, a Catholic or Protestant, a him or a her? Or the biggest question of all, did God even exist? I had all these questions, so I asked my parents, yes, God does exist, they said, and was a Republican, my father assured me. And a Catholic, my mother said. And a man, our priest said. And though I no longer trusted the nuns, I was hoping God was a Catholic and looked down from heaven every Sunday at St. Mary's Queen of Peace Catholic Church and saw me kneeling in prayer and thought well of me. I had since confessed to hating God to our priest, Father McLaughlin, who took it in stride and told me to say 3 Hail Marys and 2 Our Fathers, and that I would be forgiven, which I did just to be on the safe side. Much of my religious life from then on, all through my teen years, could probably be defined as being on the safe side. That kind of defined my early spirituality. After testing God once and surviving the encounter, I decided not to push my luck. So went through First Communion, and as Garrison Keillor says, stood up and said with confidence things that have confounded theologians for centuries. I became an altar boy, waking up early on Saturday mornings to serve the Mass, hoping God noticed that too. It was kind of an era of detente. Richard Nixon had reached out to China, and I was reaching out to God, with the understanding that if I did, God wouldn't strike me dead. That if Richard Nixon could strike a deal with China, then I could certainly make peace with God. And God apparently loved deals, because here was the deal for me when I was growing up. If I belonged to the one true church and went to Mass every Sunday and confessed my sins every Saturday, I'd go to heaven when I died. Or so the nuns told me. And then after the deal was inked, I read the fine print. No eating meat on Fridays, never skipping confession on Saturday night, no attending the Baptist church with my sister, who had jumped the Catholic ship and hooked up with the Baptist and was headed straight to hell. The nun had mentioned none of this when I had joined. I had been hoodwinked, taken for a ride, falling for the oldest trick in the book, one hand moving the walnut shells, the other hand hiding the pea. What if I ever leave the one true church, I asked the nun. When you die, she said, you will spend eternity apart from God in eternal torment. How do you know that, I asked. Because I'm a nun. And then she warned Father McLaughlin that I bore watching, and he caught me alone in the altar boy room and told me I was a disappointment to God. How do you know, I asked. Because I'm a priest, he said. This was back in the days when religious authorities were widely admired and generally believed, so I prayed every Sunday for God to forgive me and vowed to walk the straight and narrow path and become a priest when I was older, so I too could scare small children and get them right with God. I told no one except for Father McLaughlin one Sunday morning while preparing for Mass, who seemed elated with the notion of my becoming a priest, but failed to mention I wouldn't be able to marry and would have to sit alone in my house each night trying not to think of girls, which I was just then starting to do. So I decided to talk it over with a nun. I said, what happens if I become a priest and fall in love and leave the church to get married? When you die, you will spend eternity in hell apart from God, in eternal torment, she said. And I had to hand it to the church. It was nothing if not consistent. But I wondered how they knew these things. How could they speak with such certainty? Certainty seemed the dominant theme of every religious person I knew. Their church had the truth, the capital T truth, and no one else. One of my best friends was a boy named Joe Bryant, and in the 4th grade he was a Jehovah's Witness, and just as certain his church was the one true church. He gave me pamphlets to read at recess, urging me towards Jehovah, who apparently was opposed to birthdays and Christmas and Halloween, which I took as a sign from God that I should not join the Jehovah's Witnesses. But I couldn't help but wonder what would happen if the Jehovah's Witnesses were right and the Catholic Church were wrong. What if the Baptists were right, or the half-dozen folks who met every Sunday in a dinky little house on the main street in our town? What if out of all the churches in the world, those half-dozen people had nailed it on the head and were the one true church, the culmination of God's great plan to save the world? I went to school with one of them, a young girl, and so buddied up to her on the off chance the world ended and I could ride her coattails into heaven. And then, the next year, their pastor had eye problems and mistook his secretary for his wife and ran off. The one true church disbanded, and a lawyer bought the house and set out his shingle. There were never any lawyers at St. Mary's Queen of Peace. The lawyers in our town had money, and the Catholics tended not to. We were the church of labor. One did not join the Catholic Church to get ahead in the community. We had ceded that territory to the Methodists and the Episcopalians, each of whom worshiped in brand new buildings. We met in a flat-roofed building on Main Street next door to Ples Lily's Citgo gas station. It appeared we had ran out of money while building the church, so stopped after one story. It wasn't the kind of structure to inspire meditation and high thoughts. The windows were painted shut. It didn't have air conditioning. And in the summertime, we dropped like flies, fainting from the heat, our heads thumping the pews like watermelons. Ever since then, I have associated delirium with faith. What we did have going for us was longevity, which we believed was an indication of God's favor. We were the first church instituted by Jesus, the bride of Christ, launched by St. Peter, the first pope. What we lacked in building, we made up for in pedigree. The Episcopalians, the Methodists, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the half-dozen people who met on Sundays in the dinky little house on Main Street were newcomers, pretenders to the throne. We believed our institutional durability wasn't an indication of skilled management or historical accident or strategic political alliances. It was an indication of God's seal of approval. I didn't wonder about it then, but I wonder now why it is that God's favor seems always to be indicated by the one quality we possess in spades. Let a church endure, and it must surely be an indication of its chosenness. Let a church be large and wealthy, and it must surely be an indication of God's favor. Let a church be small and poor, and it must surely be an indication of God's preference for the underdog. Why this tendency to single out our defining trait and claim it as proof of God's favor? And while we're thinking about that, let's think also about the spiritual implications of our claims to divine favor. The moment we believe God is uniquely for us, we simultaneously imply God isn't for others. The moment we claim to be the one true church, we claim the other churches are not true, that their encounters with God and their collective life with Jesus is less than ours. I remember Joe Bryant and I would argue on the playground about this, staking out our territory. I, a member of the One True Church, and he, a member of Jehovah's True Community, each of us lowering ourselves to be with the other. By then I was serving with an altar boy and had become Father McLaughlin's go-to guy. And Joe was basking in the glow of his recent baptism, working the playground for converts, aiming to be one of Jehovah's 144,000 elect. And though we were friends, it eventually became clear to us that despite our friendship, our religions would not allow it to continue unless one of us threw in the towel and joined the other. And when that didn't happen, we drifted apart. Our separation was the nearly inevitable consequence of the exclusive theology we had been taught. In our efforts to draw near to God, we learned to mistrust others. When my Baptist father married my Catholic mother, his uncle wrote to warn him that the Pope would take their children. Something I think from time to time my father wished would happen. But in a letter he wrote to my dad, he urged him not to marry my mother, that no good can come of it. My father took that letter and read it aloud at their 50th anniversary wedding party. And my siblings and I had a good laugh at that. But this is more than just a Catholic thing. I once went to visit an elderly member of my Quaker meeting. I didn't know the man well. He hadn't been active in our meeting since my arrival as its pastor a dozen years before. And though I introduced myself, he was hard of hearing and had bad eyesight. And so he mistook me for someone else. And he was, as I said, nearly deaf, could barely see. And I was able, after much shouting, to make him understand that I was bringing greetings from our Quaker meeting. And he looked at me and he said, "Did you hear what they've gone and done?" Who has gone and done?" I asked. He said, "Our Quaker meeting, they've gone and hired a Catholic." And I realized he was referring to me. "The Catholics sent him to turn us into a Catholic church," he said. I imagined the Pope surrounded by his cardinals pointing to a map of central Indiana saying, "I want that little Quaker meeting. Is Gulley still with us? Send him." Yes, that had been my life's goal, to be a sleeper agent for the Roman Catholic Church, to worm my way into the religious society of friends at the age of 16, slowly gaining their trust until I was encouraged to become a pastor, then enrolling in college and graduate school, becoming recorded as a Quaker minister, pastoring one Quaker meeting after another, building my credentials until I would be invited to pastor a meeting outside Indianapolis in order to lead its 90 souls into the waiting bosom of the Roman Catholic faith. Jeez. On the day I was recorded as a Quaker minister, I invited my Catholic grandparents to come and watch. My grandmother was 92. It was the first time she had ever been in a Protestant church. After the ceremony, she came up to me in tears and hugged me and said, "You are the first one in our family in over 600 years to leave the Catholic Church." Oh, I was devastated. And then I thought later, how would she know that? 600 years? She couldn't even remember the name of her grandmother. But at the time, it was just this heavy weight. And someone took a picture of us right at that moment. And my grandmother just looked terrified, clutching her handbag to her bosom, fearful God would find her there and strike her dead, that she would die in a Quaker meeting and not get a Catholic burial and be buried in the Catholic cemetery. Oh, thank God we're not like that anymore. I mean, seriously, can you imagine how terrible it would be if religions still believed their faith was the one true faith? That would be horrible. Christians would not only mistrust one another, we would fear Muslims and Jewish people and every other group not part of our own. Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims would be killing one another right and left. Hindus and Muslims would be killing one another at each other's throats. Jewish people and Palestinians would be up in arms. It would be a mess. Thank God it's not like that anymore. Let me say what should be obviously clear to anyone who has thought carefully about religion. There is no one true church, no one true faith, no single path to God. There are only people who have, by accidents of birth and geography and lineage, approached God differently. I was born into a Catholic family in a small Midwestern town. By then, the Catholics had been around only 1,900 years, though humans had possessed the ability to think symbolically, a necessary element of religious practice, for over 100,000 years. How fortunate, I would tell myself when I was a kid, that I had been born during that microscopically thin slice of time that the one true church had existed. But wait, it gets better. The particular Catholic church I attended had existed less than 40 years when I was born. Prior to that, the nearest Catholic church was several towns away, so my mother, had we moved to town a generation earlier, might well have decided to attend the Methodist church on the next block, or the Quaker meeting down the street, or the Baptist church 5 blocks away. I remember thinking to myself, oh God, I'm so fortunate that I wasn't born into those churches. I'm so fortunate. I would have been so screwed. Thank you, God, for making me a member of the one true church. Fortunately, God wanted to do this. God wanted me to enjoy the spiritual blessings of belonging to the only church, so had thoughtfully arranged the circumstances to make it possible. Now, there were tens of millions of people born in 1961, so you can imagine how grateful I was that God would go to all that trouble to guarantee my eternal well-being. Of course, one could look at the matter differently. One could believe that truth isn't measured by longevity or status or obedience to Scripture. One could believe that true religion is practiced wherever mercy and peace and justice flower. One could believe that true religion isn't a matter of correct categories, but is a matter of compassion. Compassion. That is the common thread through all the religions. Compassion. One could believe that the exclusivity of the one true church or the only way to God is a gross denial of God's wide participation in the human story. One could reject altogether our selfish insistence that we alone hold the monopoly on faith. The nuns and priests of my childhood were kind people, teaching what they had been taught. They were kind, and they were mistaken, like I have been mistaken whenever I have been exclusive. There is no one true church. There is no one true faith. There is no single path to God. There is only compassion and grace, and wherever they are found, God is present. God is present. It took me a long time to get to that place in my religion. To surrender the confidence that I had always placed in human institutions, and to recognize that God had no pride and worked wherever love and compassion were present. But when I began to believe that, that was the first unlearning. And it's mostly what this book is about. I talk about other things I've unlearned, that God only works through men and not women. I've had to unlearn things I was taught about homosexuality. I've had to unlearn things I was taught about the Bible, about doctrines, about creeds. I've had to unlearn what it meant to be saved. I've had to unlearn what it meant to be a citizen of the world. I had to unlearn that America was not a Christian nation or somehow uniquely blessed by God. I had to unlearn a lot of things, and that's what this book is about. I guarantee you there will be at least one chapter in the book that will offend you. So I urge you to read it, because those are the books we need to read, and I hope you enjoy it. I think it's coming out next year, sometime next February. My editor is wrestling with it now and is getting a little frightened of it, and asked me recently if I could take out the chapter on America is a Christian nation. And he said, that's not a good message right now. I said, it's needed right now. So we're in discussion. If that chapter doesn't show up, you'll know I lost. And he pulled editorial power on me. Well, let's open it up. I've talked way too much for a Quaker. And since this is our last time together, we can talk about anything. Peak experiences, writing, religious exclusivity, and the damage it causes. Just anything at all. I've always loved question and answer times. I just wish we could do question and answer times.
Unlearning is a struggle, and it's painful to leave the comfort and the security, the certainty of understanding and launch into the unknown. Lloyd Gearing and many other great thinkers of all times have told us that the concept of God is a human construct. What is now your concept of God?
Well, that's the very last chapter of the book. And the editor told me, he said, that's not enough, it needs to be longer. I said, well, if I knew more about God, it would obviously be longer, wouldn't it? I guess I would say God is my granddaughter. Because when she was born, it unified a family that had been torn apart by alcoholism. And I think that's what God does. God causes us to delight and to recreate and to give life anew. And that is what my granddaughter has done for our family. And that's a short chapter. But if anyone has ever had anybody present in their life who has done that, by their innocence, by their delight in life, by their loving acceptance of everyone in the family, and largely my granddaughter's delight in my father, whom I no longer delighted in. And she taught me how to do that again. So I would say God is that presence that unites and teaches us over and over again how to love anew. Yeah. I figured out why people love their grandchildren. Yeah, it's a new, it's like a year of Jubilee. You know, the debts are forgiven. And you start over again. So I think God's like that. God's like Jubilee. Yeah.
Good. I want to. Could you take us into a Quaker meeting? You mentioned in the first talk about not saying too much, or saying and then not saying. How do people respond when someone feels compelled to say something about the political environment or war, or do people get into debates? Is there kind of counterpoint reactions in that process?
Sometimes that happens, and that's not us at our best. The day after the election, a woman stood up in our meeting and spoke for 15 minutes about her disgust with Donald Trump and what had happened. And she sat down. She was very angry. There are a lot of Republicans in my congregation because it's in Indiana. And Quakers became Republicans when Lincoln freed the slaves. And Quakers are slow to change, and so a lot of them have remained Republicans. So this lady ranted, and that was the only word for it. It was clearly out of the spirit. She was just very upset and had not checked her. Her better side did not emerge. She sat down, so we sat for about 10 minutes. It was awkward silence. And then a woman stood up, a weighty friend, and she said, "And yet Jesus embraced the thief," and sat down. And that just shifted everything. And yet Jesus embraced the thief. And because she kept saying that Donald Trump was a thief. He had stolen these students' money. He cheated people out of their money. He didn't pay his contractors. And he was a thief. He was a thief. And for 15 minutes, and then 5 minutes, 10 minutes of silence, and then this woman saying, "And yet Jesus embraced the thief." And so it ended up being a very powerful experience. And saved me from having to say something, because I would have just stood up there and just gone on and made an idiot out of myself and not solved the issue. And yet here was this weighty friend, which is why we call her a weighty friend. And yet Jesus embraced the thief, and that was it. And the meeting just shifted. The lady stood up. We entered back into silence. About 5 minutes later, the woman stood, the first woman, and said, "Perhaps I should have been more thoughtful," and sat down. And then, as we Quakers say, things opened up. And it was a very healing experience. And some form of that has happened almost every Sunday since, but it isn't politicized. It's what can we do? How do we live? How do we treat one another? How do we love the neighbor? So out of that, which is why I think the election of Donald Trump is ultimately going to be a good thing for America and a good thing for the world. Because we're going to have to rise to the occasion. Yeah. And I'd say that no matter, I think every leader that we elect poses that same challenge. It's just we don't recognize it because some of them are more politically palatable. But they all bring their issues. And so the ongoing question for us is always, how do we live in this moment? How do we love the neighbor? Yeah.
Just in thinking about kind of like the mystery of God, or not being able to define God really, is there a difference between that and you mentioned being a thoughtful atheist? is there a difference?
Well, I think the problem with atheism is the same problem of fundamentalism, that it claims a certainty that can't be known. I always liked Robert Ingersoll, the orator, the great orator of the 1800s, who it was, we know, spoke to more people than any other American of his generation. He was in the golden age of oratory, the last 20 years, last 30 years of the 1800s. And he referred to himself as the great agnostic. How many of you are familiar with Robert Ingersoll? Yeah, not many. And here's a guy who spoke, as I said, to more Americans than any other person. Had a profound effect on people, and I always liked his approach. He wouldn't call himself an atheist because he believed it was too conclusive, too certain. So he was called the happy agnostic, and traveled from town to town to give speeches, and there would be a field with 10,000 people in it, and he would let go. His brother-in-law was a publisher. When Robert Ingersoll died, Mark Twain said of him, "No death has affected me so gravely, save the death of my daughter." He was just a wonderful man, written out of history's pages, because America then entered into a period of revivalism, and we forgot all about Robert Ingersoll. But his brother-in-law was a publisher, and so when Ingersoll died, his brother-in-law collected in a 26-volume collection all of his speeches, the best of which have been culled into another book that came out a couple years ago. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the woman who edited that book. But if you go to Amazon and type in Robert Ingersoll, it'll come up. But I think there's a difference between that, not knowing how to define God, and defining oneself as an atheist. One has an element of seeking. One has an element of certainty that I'm uncomfortable with, in the same way I'm uncomfortable with fundamentalism. It just draws a boundary, which I don't think we can How do I define atheism? I define atheism as the unswerving conviction that there is no God, that God doesn't exist. And so I would say to them the same thing I would say to the person who says, I am certain God exists. I'd say, well, I know I've had experiences where I really felt and believed that. What's your empirical proof? And neither side can supply it. And the only thing ultimately that we can fall back on with any credibility is our personal experience. That's why I think these peak experiences are so important, because I think those are windows into the divine. And I mean, that's what Maslow thought. And so again, it's the certainty that I reject, and the realization that it might well be the case that there might be an entity, a presence that can't be empirically proven, but that has been understood by billions of people to be a real presence. I mean, that's what the Quakers called God, the real presence, capital R, capital P. And that this real presence was in all people. Yeah.
How does the Bible fit within your scheme?
Well, as you said, I think the Bible is stories of peak experiences. Now, I think sometimes those peak experiences were misinterpreted. For instance, someone obviously had a peak experience that God wanted a land to be given to the Hebrews. And in their peak experience, they also had this insight, they believe, that God wanted them to kill everyone who wasn't like them so that they could have that land. I would say that was a misinterpretation of a peak experience. And yet it has worked its way into the sacred story. And after a while, it becomes sacred truth. But I would say when I read the Bible, I see over and over again, it's a collection of peak experiences. Not all of it. Some of it's law. Some of it's prophecy. Some of it's wisdom literature. It's a variety of things. But at its heart are these recollections of peak experiences, some of which I think were probably spot on. Others of which I think were misinterpreted. Because that is one danger of peak experiences. We tend to be their sole interpreters. And if we get it wrong, it can be problematic. Yeah. Like George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, had a peak experience on Pendle Hill in England. And he said, I had this vision of a great people to be gathered. Well, that's, great people to be gathered. Those are very winsome ideas. But then over time, Quakers began to understand that in a very exclusive way. We are the great people God gathered, you see. And that was something Fox never meant. Yeah. Fox meant a great people, not the great people. And there's a real difference. Yeah.
When I reach that point after the unlearning, that I start to find myself empty. I've unlearned some things, but I haven't learned, I don't have any new understandings yet.
You don't have a new girlfriend yet?
No, I don't have a new girlfriend.
Okay.
When would it be a better strategy to retell and reinterpret an old story, and when would it be better strategy to create a new story?
I think when your experience requires it, when your experience demands a new interpretation. And I'll tell you something, I'll illustrate this by telling you something I unlearned and then later relearned. I once learned the confession was absolutely necessary for my spiritual well-being. And then when I left the Catholic Church, I unlearned that. And I said, how arrogant that a man could claim to offer forgiveness from God when I can go to God directly myself and ask forgiveness. How arrogant of the church to tell me that. How arrogant of the priest to imply that. So I was thoroughly committed to unlearning that. And then something happened. It took about 30 years. But I found myself I was depressed. And I could not figure out why. And so I went to a therapist, which I had never done. I went to a therapist. I said, I feel like crap. And she was very insightful. This woman was incredibly insightful. She said, we started talking, and she realized that my depression was born out of a sense of guilt, that I had done something that I felt horrible about and didn't know how to remedy that. And she led me into a period of confession and forgiveness. And boy, don't you wish I'd tell you what it was? Wouldn't that be fascinating? It involved unkindness to my wife. I was faithful, but I was unkind and failed to appreciate her as I should have. And this had become a pattern. And so she led me into this over a period of several meetings together, that I had a real need for forgiveness, and I had a real need for another person to speak forgiveness to me, other than my wife, who I would, talk with about this. And it made me rethink. So I thought, I don't need that anymore. And then I went back and married it again. That belief again, because I realized. So what drove me to that was my life experience. So when you ask, how do we know? I think what we do is we read our lives, and we sense that when our experiences in life might require that of us, something new. or perhaps a reevaluation of something we had thought we no longer needed, that's when we become aware of it. But it means listening to your life. Yeah.
I'll just speak loud.
Oh, well, sure. Yeah. Or the science book. Yeah. 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 And the other mistake, and I've been through this in my life, I'm just now coming back to preaching from the Bible. I didn't for years. In fact, my wife and I were driving home from meeting one day last year, and she said, "Do you realize it has been 5 sermons? You've gone 5 sermons without once mentioning God or Jesus?" I said, "No, that's interesting. I don't pay attention to that." And she said, "I've just noticed that." She said, "I thought it was interesting." That's all she said. And then I thought, I wonder why that is. And then I got to thinking, well, I guess it's because the people who I've been hearing speak about God and Jesus, I really don't like them. And then I thought, well, then speak about God and Jesus in a way that is true to you. And I thought to do that, I had to go back into other teachings, and so began reading Borg again and Spong and reinterpreting those stories. Amy Jill Devine. One great way to preach the New Testament is to read rabbis. Boy, they know it. It's their book. People always say the Old Testament is the Jewish book. Don't you believe it? It's the New Testament. I don't think it can be properly interpreted apart from the Jewish experience. So now I talk about it all the time, and I have a Bible reading now every Sunday in meeting, and it's been a rich experience. Yeah. I was preaching on everything else. I was preaching about Abraham Maslow one Sunday. And it's helpful stuff. It really is helpful. But it wasn't the full breadth of the human experience. So, yeah. Was there a comment here? Yeah.
One thing about, I'd like to get your opinion on it in terms of someone who had a background very similar to yours, and left the church. And it's the feeling of loss and also almost jealousy of the folks who have remained. And maybe it's that sense of loss of community too. So if you're a questioning person, if you're a person, a seeker, you might have to sacrifice that community. And that's a great loss.
It's a huge loss. Yeah. Which is why some people persist in religious communities even as they're saying the creeds with their fingers crossed, because they don't want to lose the community. And if you can't do that in good conscience, it just means you need to grow a new community or join a new community. It is a loss, though, and we kid ourselves when we say, I can leave this easily, because we can't. It's still a part of us. We leave it physically, but we don't leave it emotionally. We don't leave it internally. It's still a part of who we are. I think I would probably still be Catholic if at a young age, instead of being exposed to the Catholics I were exposed to, who were products of their environment, if I had been exposed to a Richard Rohr or Thomas Merton. I had to join the Protestants to learn about Thomas Merton. That's why when people say to me, are you angry at the Catholics? Do you hate Catholics? Oh, God, of course not. I went to a Catholic university. I read Catholic theology and spirituality today. It resonates with me. I'm sad that the whole breadth of the Catholic tradition was never taught to so many people who realized that so instead of being taught about the one true church and the exclusivity, I could have been hearing Richard Rohr or Merton and learning about this expansive, the Joan Chittisters of the Catholic world. And what a loss. And if I'd been exposed to that, I probably wouldn't have left. even if the Quaker girls had been prettier, I probably would not have left. Yeah. Yeah. It's the exclusivity that I reject, which again is a problem for all religion. Mm-hmm.
Well, you've given me a lot to think about, but I'm trying to clarify something. I really like what you said about the peak experiences,
Mm-hmm.
and that people who are truly alive are living out of that experience. So for me, it's a lot of just being accepted for who I am, and accepting of others, and learning little nuggets about God that I know that part of his character.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I think about what you said about the unlearning God, that seems to be more, to me, something that's personal and reflective, because I wouldn't want to judge someone else by something they haven't, that I've unlearned that they haven't. You know,
Mm-hmm.
to celebrate their journey with God of where they are. So
Mm-hmm.
kind of just wanting to be sure that
Well, what we should never imply to anybody is that when they're smart and wise like us, they'll agree with us. What we also have to realize, and I think this is profoundly difficult, is that when we have these experiences, these peak experiences, these insights, they are so wonderful for us, we naturally assume they will be of interest to others, and not only of interest to others, but will somehow also be compulsory for others. That the insights and experiences we've gained, that we have found valuable and enriching in our own lives, must then be embraced by others. And that isn't how peak experiences work, and that isn't how peak experiences should enlighten and energize our lives. It's a gift for you. It's a gift for you. Now, what you make of that gift is your gift to the world. But you can't be expected, for instance, to obey something I learned in a peak experience that I had.
but it makes you more truly alive, and that's what I'm enjoying being around people who have that spiritual life.
Well, it makes me feel more fully alive. Yeah. Some would say, when I share a peak experience, that it didn't make me alive at all. It made me a heretic. So I guess it's all how you... that one person's aliveness is another person's heresy.
When you mentioned the creed, it brought back that I would usually leave out the resurrection of the body part because I'm going to be cremated, and so that can't be true. What I'm now relearning is remembering God saying, before you were, I knew you. And that's what I'll be resurrected to.
Yeah.
Is that reality before me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think we have time for 2 more questions. Let's go here and then there.
When you and I, as I would, say that we believe in God, I think we have to admit that we're probably fooling a lot of people into thinking that we believe things that we don't. So he believes in God, and he must believe, kind of similar to me, right? And other people who do not believe in God and then hear us describe what we think God is, as you did before, would say you're kind of being disingenuous. You're kind of playing games with words because you don't believe in the God that the vast majority of people do. Next year we have a speaker coming in, Greta Vosper. I'm not sure if you know her, but she's the notorious atheist pastor who has just said we need to get past that word God. I mean, we all believe in compassion and community and so on, but that word God is causing problems that maybe we should think about getting rid of.
It is a freighted word. Yeah, especially when we start putting it on money. Yeah. And was there a question here?
Would you please talk about prayer in the Quaker faith?
It would depend on the Quaker. I can tell you what this Quaker believes about prayer. And And what prayer is for me is deep attentiveness to another. So that I don't tell people that I will pray for them. When I want to be involved and feel led to be involved in the life of someone who is suffering, my custom now is to go to them and listen to them as deeply and be present with them as deeply as I am able in that moment. So that prayer for me has become a communion of sorts, a deep knowing. Because I lost hope in the idea that if I said the right words or had the right degree of faith or belief, that I could somehow cause God to alter, to intervene in space and time to change reality. When I saw that did not happen, I stopped praying for people. And I didn't pray for a long time, not even from the pulpit. Even when I was asked to, I would just say, I don't feel comfortable doing that. And that went on for some time. And then I got to thinking about prayer. And I got to remembering in my life times when people had been very present for me. And I began to listen to synonyms that people used to describe prayer. And I thought, oh, that's how I felt when this person came and sat with me. My wife and I lost a child, our first child, and our minister came to sit with us, and he didn't say a word. He just sat with us for 3 hours, and I never felt more prayed for in my whole life. And so now that's just how I. Somebody says, will you pray for me? I just say, when would you like to be together? And I just go and I sit with them. Yeah. Because I don't know that it would do any good if that night laying in bed I asked God to lighten their hearts. You know, I don't know that God can do that. But I know if I go sit with them and listen to them, that maybe that can help. So, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yes, you've indicated that peak experiences tend to be personal or individual.
Mm-hmm.
In your meetings, do you not have a community peak experience?
We've had them before, yes. Yeah. Friends call that a gathered meeting. And what you'll hear when you leave are people saying things like, wasn't worship wonderful today? And I'll say, what about it made it that way? And the answer is almost always the same. They say, we just felt so together. Yeah. Doesn't happen every Sunday. God, I wish it did. I wish it were some formula, like baking, like making a cake, that if you just threw in these ingredients, it would just happen. And I've also found it has no correlation with the sermon. Much to my disappointment, because I'll write that sermon and I'll think this is the best sermon I've ever written, and I'll give it and it'll, and then I'll go into meeting and I'll think, well, golly, I was busy this week, I was distracted, this is a crappy sermon, I shouldn't even give it. And I'll get up there and I'll give it, and for some reason it will spark someone who will then pick up the pieces of it and carry it on and illumine and enlighten in a way that I was unable to. And those tend to be the things that, yeah. Is there a question?
Phil, I think at this point we probably need to wrap it up, but I want to say that I think your book's got a lot of promise. Do you have a question here?
We had one question here.
If you don't believe in hell, what about heaven or the afterlife?
Yeah. I wrote a whole book about heaven, and now I wish I hadn't. Really wasn't about heaven. It was about God's commitment to the eternal well-being of all people, which we have assumed was heaven. I now tell people, I hope there is a heaven. I don't need it. I've had a great life. And the idea of God needing to give me a bliss for eternity, forget it. My God, I don't need it. I have bliss. But there's a little boy who lives down the street from us who's a foster kid, and that child has just had a horrible life. So I hope there's a heaven for him. I really do. I don't know if there is, because I haven't died yet. But if there is one, I hope that's the kid who gets it. I don't need it. I love the story Madeline Lingo used to tell. When the man dies and goes to heaven, he looks around, it's all empty, and he says to St. Peter, he says, where are the saints? Where are the Christians? And St. Peter says, oh, they're in hell ministering to the damned. Yeah.
Well,
I just love that.
well, thank you very much for a great talk.